Hello and welcome to episode 9 of The Dirty Corner. In this episode I'm going to be reacting to my disciplinary meeting, which was the previous episode, and if you haven't seen that then click this link here and watch what happens there, because I have taken some notes. I'm going to be reading these notes here as quickly as possible because I don't want to waste too much time and there's lots of notes. So this episode is called what am I going to call it? I don't know. Some kind of title I'll put here. Okay. So here are my notes. I'm going to go through them as quickly as possible. At the start of the meeting, the faculty number 1, as I label him in the meeting, says it's been a difficult last couple of years, and he's talking about the pandemic. He says, I think that's part of the context. I just want to clarify, I don't think it is part of the context, because we made the podcast about our experience at uni. Our experience at uni became worse and worse, and that started with the first year where bully number 1 and bully number 2 would be harassing and insulting and upsetting my German friend until she left. That happened in the first year, which was 2019, and the pandemic didn't hit until 2020, which is when we heard about it and when things started to change. So him saying the last couple of years wouldn't really be accurate. Point number 2, just so that you know, I have 18 points, so I'm sorry if this seems boring, but I'm going to try to clarify my thoughts on a lot of these things. This is a quote. We are keen as an institution to hear the student voice. I found that a little bit insulting to watch back, because they're obviously not. Whenever I would raise an objection to things that he said, he would offer a little petty defence and then move on so that I couldn't respond to his retort to my criticism of the institution. So it was a bit like a gish gallop, as it's called, which is where somebody makes lots and lots of statements and you can only address so many of them, because there's been so much that's been said that you can't possibly address everything that's become an issue. You can only address certain things that you remember, and that's how I felt in this meeting. Point number 3, quote, I'm aware I'm aware the institution wasn't named. It's fairly self-evident that you're talking about, and then he says the name of the university. I found that quite interesting, and I wish in hindsight that I would have said to him, why is it evident? It's only evident if you work here or if you go to school here and you watch the podcast. If you don't, and we're not advertising at the university, how would you possibly know that we're talking about that school? So everyone's completely safe, and even if you do go to the school, you'd know we're talking about the school, but you wouldn't know which students we're talking about unless you're aware of the incidents of bullying. Anyway, so that was something which I wish I would have said, but I didn't say. But he said that we've done that. He said, I'm aware the institution wasn't named. It's fairly self-evident that you're talking about the uni. And then he said, so you've done that, which in itself is fine. Which in itself, that's fine, he said. Sorry, I'm just trying to read the quote accurately. Which is interesting that we can talk about the uni and it's unnamed. And he said, and that's fine. And then the next point which I've got is, the issue is to get your view on the impact that's happened that we've had reported from other students and staff. So it's not that we've talked about the uni. The issue is to get your view, as in mine and my studio friend's view, on the impact that's happened, as in the reaction by people who were guilty of these things that we raised in the podcast. That's the impact on them that's happened, that they've had reported, the uni's had reported to them from students and staff, who will only be the people who did these things. That was the issue. That's why we were in this meeting. Point number 5. It's not a question of you've said this and you've said that or whatever. on the podcast, which to me I interpreted as a he said, she said, which is what I've heard before in a meeting in a workplace. And it was basically their way of saying, we don't want to know what's happened. We don't want you to go into what's happened. We just want to address this. So they want to kind of draw a line under the problem and say, right, that's underlined now. Let's talk about something else. And the problem is, you've upset these people. It doesn't matter what these people have done that you've talked about it. The fact that you've talked about it has upset them. That's what we're here to talk about. That's my impression of what he was saying. Point number 6, several people felt that individuals could be identified from what was said on the podcast. That's interesting. To be fair, my studio friend brought this up quite well, saying, we only described the incidents of bullying, and how would they identify themselves? That just shows that it's true what we're saying, which surely is the bigger, more important issue, is that these things have happened, not that we've spoke about it as sensitively as possible. And it's funny, I wish I would have said to him, if I were to now say a member of staff was made aware that bully number 1 showed images of a sexual nature, that he was going to get printed onto a t-shirt to psychologically torment someone in the studio. Now, do you think I'm talking about you? I should have said to faculty member number 1, because I'm pretty sure you don't, because you didn't do anything like that. Now, when I do say that, if I said that on the podcast, the member of staff who was guilty of being aware of this from bully number 1 would be upset that now they, I'm going to refer to them as the dean's wife, would feel as though they're being exposed for wrongdoing. Anyway, I should have said that. I didn't say that. It's very annoying to think that we had to go through all of this nonsense to try and justify what had happened. I just want to go into the fact that I said it's a vexatious claim, because that wasn't contextualized very well. Part of the reason why, when I read the statement at the beginning of the episode saying that, we've got this notification, let me see if I can quickly go through it, where we've had a notice that we're getting disciplined. We're going to a meeting to be disciplined for talking about the uni and people at the uni on a podcast. It said, you should refer to section 7 of the attached procedure and provide confirmation by Wednesday, 27th of April, that you agree to the matter being dealt with under the summary procedure and will attend the meeting. If you wish to submit any written evidence for consideration, this should be submitted by Tuesday, the 3rd of May. Now, the section 7 of the procedure, from what I recall, had that these types of meetings can be thrown out if you can provide a reason that it should be considered as a vexatious claim, and that's what we did. We made our case that it's a vexatious claim based on the fact that we'd evidenced these claims of bullying we were making, and therefore they were just responding by saying, no, you've upset us by talking about this. That's why I said vexatious claim. Point number 8, evidence from students and staff as to the hurt and upset. That's what's in the podcast has caught. That's what's, I mean, this is written word for word, so maybe that's how he said it, but what is in the podcast has caused. I think it's trying to say that what was in the podcast caused hurt and upset to staff and students, and that was evidence. I wish I would have said, what is that evidence? Because if it's only testimony, then that pales in comparison to the evidence that we have that's photographic, audio and video recordings, as well as written and verbal testimony from students who've been the victim of bullying, brutal bullying. So if their evidence is that they're upset that we've been talking about bullying, in context it's kind of, who cares? It's nonsense. It's like someone hits you and you say, you just hit me, and them saying, ow, it hurts my feelings that you said I've hit you. It just doesn't make sense, does it? It's annoying. Point number 9, the OIA gets mentioned, and I didn't really get the opportunity to mention what that was. So I put in a complaint about the bullying. I had 3 other students support the complaint. I had 2 students who weren't part of the support for the complaint, but were helping, one of which is my studio friend, and the other one was another person who was helping by trying to be somewhat impartial, but obviously knew that me and others weren't causing the problems in the studio, that there were just problems and they needed resolving. So I put in this complaint to the university. It was denied as far as it wasn't successful. I appealed the decision, that was denied, and then I put it through to the OIA, which is the Office of Independent Adjudicators. It took a lot of writing, a lot of discussion, a lot of checking back and forth with all three of the other students, that they were, happy with everything that I was saying and that the OIA was saying. That's who I was talking about there. And it annoyed me that he kept saying that his faculty number one kept saying that, well, that complaint is now with the OIA, we'll see what happens there. That suggested to me he was trying to quieten down the details of the complaint and saying that's part of that complaint, we're not talking about that. Annoying. Point number 10, separate issues that have been raised in the complaint. Separate issues that have been raised in the complaint. I've not quite written enough to know what I'm talking about there. Separate issues that have been raised in the complaint. Maybe that's just what I just said, is that he was trying to separate the issues in the complaint from what we were in the disciplinary meeting for. I don't know, I should have written more details for that point. Point number 11. He asked me what I feel the impact has been on other students. And I asked him, what other students do you mean? And he said, are you saying that all students have been bullied? I think that was really cheap straw man question to raise. And I should have said, are you saying that they're either bullies or the victims of bullying? Because I'm asking whether you're talking about the victims of bullying, the bullies, or students who are not involved with either bullying or being bullied. That's what I'm asking. And I should have said that. I didn't say that. I was panicking, I was stressed, and I'm making excuses now. He said, quote, this is faculty number one again, said, you've used the word bullying/bullied, which I thought was interesting. You've used the word. I think he knew full well that it was a legitimate label for what had been occurring in the studio and outside the studio, actually. But I just thought it was passive aggressive to say you've used the word bullying and bullied. Yes, that was just something that annoyed me that I thought I'd write down. Point number 13, images printed on a t-shirt, which I mentioned a moment ago when saying I should have said to faculty number one, if I said that a member of staff was aware that bully number one was going to print images on a t-shirt of a sexual nature. I say of a sexual nature, it's kind of sexually provocative images from somebody who's a cross-dresser who bully number one was suggesting looked similar in the face to someone who was in the studio who was quite a vulnerable student, and bully number one wanted to print those images onto a t-shirt to torment the person in the studio, which shows how immature and unpleasant he was. Point number 14, podcast about making art and our creative process. That was the point of the Studio Buddies podcast. It was supposed to be about two people at art school talking about making art and our creative process. But we would find that every episode we'd be bringing up things about uni, and it was hard not to because it was weighing down on both of us. And if you're interested, there is a playlist on my channel called Studio Buddies, and you can go through those episodes. Now, we don't go into the severity of what's happened. Part of the reason why I'm doing this podcast is because I want to take it quite serious what's happened, because in retrospect, it was far more serious than what me and my studio friend were in the podcast Studio Buddies. Anyway, so that's what my studio friend makes as a point, is that the podcast was supposed to be about our art making, our creative process. It wasn't supposed to be about talking about uni and the problems at uni and bullying. That was just an overwhelming fact that we couldn't escape and we wish we could. Point number 15, so there's only 4 points left. Suspended from Uni2 platform. I mentioned this at one point, that this is one of the ways that he's trying to say look, you've got the freedom to express how you feel about uni with these different platforms, and one of which was Uni2. And I was suspended from there. I made this point in the meeting, and it was by, well, I suspect it was by the Associate Dean, because I've got good reason to think, because he was on there messaging quite a lot. And I would say, if you look at what the Associate Dean's just said, it makes me feel this, and I'd put that in a statement in the Uni2 platform, and he resented that I was pointing out to other students, look at the language he's using. I don't know how it makes you feel, but it makes me feel this. And I did that a couple of times with things that I thought was problematic behaviour from him. And I found that all of a sudden, in one fell swoop, 3 of my comments had been given a strike, and then I'd had a second, third strike, so I was suspended from the platform. And I was unable to communicate on there. Point number 16, the impact was the first note he must have been given in this meeting, the faculty number 1 in this meeting. I apologise for always making that sound, I've got digestion issues. The 3 points he must have had for this meeting is the impact. Ask him about what they think the impact was. He was going on and on about what was the impact. Yeah, but what do you think the impact was? And what was the impact on other students? What was the impact on the people involved? You know, that. And then the next point he must have had was your intentions, as in what were your intentions making the podcast? What are your intentions in raising these issues? You know, trying to get us to implicate ourselves in some kind of tit for tat, which is not what we were doing. And the third point he raises in the meeting is there anything you need to do now as a result of having learnt that people have been upset by this or affected badly? And that annoyed me, because it was sort of suggesting that we've done something really wrong. What is it we need to do now? Or what is it we feel we need to do now to try and make it right? That was the suggestion from that question. And it annoyed me that he went to my studio friend first, and you can see it on my face. If you watch the video, you can see my face go, you can just sort of see me thinking, that is a slimy move that he said, no, I'm not going to go to Simon first, I'm going to go to studio friend first, because they're younger. They may not have as an aggressive a response to this as Simon, and my response being aggressive, by that I just mean I was fired up and ready to answer by saying, why are we being pointed at as a problem when we're not the problem? And then he said there'll be 2 possible outcomes from this meeting. 1, nothing will happen as a response for the disciplinary meeting. And 2, it could proceed to the formal stage of the procedure. And I'll tell you in a minute which one actually happened. And then the last point I've got here is I've mentioned that there is no informal mediation, and he said that we might be past that point, which I imagine we are if we're being put into a disciplinary meeting. But that would have been a reasonable way for them to say, oh, this podcast has gone up, we feel targeted by what they discussed on the podcast, we should have an informal meeting, as opposed to taking them to a disciplinary for saying things on a podcast that we feel it was us they were talking about. That warrants an informal meeting, not a disciplinary. Anyway, that's that. So I did absolutely steam through those points, as much as there was 18 points. I tried to get through them as quick as possible. It was frustrating for me to watch, and for me to kind of be a stenographer for. And so it's not perfect captions that I typed up, but it was as close as possible. The reason why I don't put all the ers and ums into what I'm saying and I do into the faculty member isn't to pick on him. It's because you can't hear them as well, because I've altered the voice of my studio friend and faculty number 1. So I wanted to make sure that what you were reading was pretty accurate to the sounds that you'd be hearing him make. Because if I said or what I said was pretty much summed up on the screen. It wasn't inaccurate. I just didn't put in every and because it wasn't unclear, the audio of me speaking. So I hope that seemed fair enough. What you didn't see is the person who I labelled as faculty number 2, who was there to take the minutes of the meeting, has been described by someone as looking like a member of the Gestapo, which I thought was humorous at the time when it was pointed out, because it is true that she was there with headphones on and she'd kind of look up like that, and she'd, whenever there was a point made where, you know, if I had a drink or something, she'd kind of like look as if to, you know, dying to kind of get any kind of body language or anything that she could write down as tone. And the reason I say that is because I've had this before years ago when I worked in a place, and every gesture that I'd make, if I'd go, oh, at part of a meeting, that I'd get written down in the meeting, but it wouldn't for anyone else. So I have experienced this before. It was a very corporate environment and it was unpleasant. Again, in hindsight, I wish I had asked for the meetings, the minutes of the meeting, because we had a right to those, and that could have been part of our defence. But this is why I put up these videos, is so that anyone watching can learn from the mistakes that I've made, as much as I tried to do the best that I could to do the right thing and not hurt anyone. I made a point in the video that we just wanted safeguards put in place to protect students after us. Because my concern now is that the same faculty, oops, sorry, I just kicked the camera. My concern now is that the same faculty are there. As far as I'm aware, they are. They've just kind of shuffled positions slightly. I think they're still in very higher positions of authority. And bully number one, as far as I'm aware, is still there, either doing talks or presentations, and has been somewhat introduced as a fairly major part of the university, as well as part of the art school. I could be wrong there, but I know that they've done their masters there. He's done his masters there. I'm not going to give him an ambiguous gender. And yeah, it's concerned me, because what's happening for the other students? It's not, you know, it's not as though his behaviour will improve. So here's the outcome of the meeting. After us doing our best to defend ourselves and point out that bullying has happened, we talk about this without mentioning the name of the school, the name of any of the people, the description of any of the people. There's no way that anyone who's not in that school would know we're talking about the school we're talking about. They wouldn't know which people we're talking about. It's only people in that school who would know. And even some of those may not know. Only if they knew about the instances of bullying and problematic behaviour. If they were already aware of that, they might say, oh, that's bully number 2 or bully number 3 or probably bully number 1. But otherwise, how would they know? They're identifying themselves based on bad behaviour. Weird. Like, you know, or another example I could have said is, if I were to say, well, a member of staff has run down the corridor and kicked a student in the back of the legs. If the guy running the meeting, faculty number 1, said, that actually upsets me that you said that, it would make me think, have you done that? Because otherwise, why would you be upset by me saying that? You'd say, prove it. None of them said prove it. They never said, where's your proof? They said, we're emotionally affected by what you've said. That, it just annoys me. It just really annoys me. Anyway, so here's the outcome of the meeting. Decision. A written warning to Simon Renshaw and studio friend that the comments within the podcast were not in line with the conduct expected of the name of the school students, and notification that if they take further action which is considered to have a harmful impact on staff or student well-being during the remaining teaching weeks of the academic year, further action may be considered, up to and including considering their suspension from attendance at the name of the street campus at specified times. All students to be reminded of what is acceptable and appropriate behaviour whilst a student of the university. Expectation is that podcast is taken down, and request to Simon Renshaw and Studio Buddy to offer an apology to affected staff and students for any hurt or offence caused. Does that make any sense to you? So we're to be given a written warning. So not a verbal warning, skip that, go straight to written warning for the podcast. Because it's not in line with their conduct. So talking about bullying happening without naming the school, the people, or any description, that's not in line with the conduct. And it's considered to have a harmful impact on the staff or student well-being. All students to be reminded of what is acceptable and appropriate behaviour. Well, surely bullying is part of that. Talking about bullying, is that not appropriate or acceptable? You cannot talk about bullying. Don't talk about it. Say you've tried to complain, you've failed, and they don't accept your complaint. Shut up about it. That's what they expect. Is that what they're saying? Because otherwise, what have we done that warrants this kind of response? And the last part, expectation that the podcast is taken down. That didn't happen. And request that Simon and the studio friend offer an apology to affected staff and students for any hurt or offence caused. Well, I wasn't offering any apology, because I think that is absolutely absurd. Now, sadly, due to the pressure of the moment, my studio friend did offer an apology. I actually helped them with how to do that to an extent, because I tried to, say to them, this is my reason for thinking we shouldn't do this. And they were insistent on doing it because they wanted better treatment and they didn't want a bad mark. And I said, we're going to get that anyway. We're not going to get good treatment anyway. You could go on your hands and knees, say, I was completely lying, I'll never do it again. We'll take down the podcast. We'll never get better treatment from them. That's not who these people are. Stand by what you've said. That's what you've got to do. We're not in the wrong here. But there was no convincing them of what to do, so they decided to apologise, blame me, which is a bit of a... I don't know. It's still, I'm just disappointed really about the way that went. And then they still didn't get a very good mark. They didn't get treated any better. They were in the out group. And I felt guilty because I felt as though I'd roped in this younger student into a problem, whereas we weren't trying to do anything wrong. We didn't think the podcast was trying to stir up trouble or trying to poke anyone to provoke them. So it was unfair, in my opinion, really unfair. But the podcast never went down, and I certainly never apologised. What a ridiculous thing to say. People have bullied others. They've recognised that when it's been discussed that that's them who are the culprits of the bullying. They're now the victims because the bullying's been discussed, so they deserve an apology. What? I mean, this is the dean's wife, bully number 1, bully number 2, bully number 3. Possibly even the associate dean, I've no idea. Maybe even the pretentious tutor, I'm not sure. Maybe just a blanket apology to everyone. And the podcast getting taken down. No, thank you. I'll pass on that one. I think I'd rather get a bad mark, continue to be treated poorly, and know that I've stood up for what I think is right, than to yield to that type of threat. But there we are, that's what happened. That was the decision. And I think it's shameful of the school, and it made me kind of detach from the association with the mark that I was given, because I think otherwise I would have wanted a better mark for my work. But what they did is, for my dissertation and degree show, I got the lowest mark you can give, which is still a pass. Therefore, I couldn't go on to do my master's, and that's how I was punished for that. Which, given that treatment from that school, is like a pass with a distinction. Because if I get high marks from that school, then I'm a sycophant, a suck-up, or someone who just keeps their head down and ignores bullying. So to get treated poorly by that school is almost a better degree to have. I need that on a certificate. You push back against these scumbags. Anyway, it always feels like time to vent. As always, all of these stories lead to the Dirty Corner. I will at the end explain the story of why this podcast is called The Dirty Corner, and that won't be too long. I don't think I'm going to do loads of these episodes, but I hope you enjoyed this one. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next week.